Eulogy on Washington, delivered at the request of the Legislature of Massachusetts, February 8, 1800. It is natural that the gratitude of mankind should be drawn to their benefactors. A number of these have successively arisen, who are no less distinguished for the elevation of their virtues than the luster of their talents. Of those, however, who were born and who acted through life as if they were born not for themselves but for their country and the whole human race, how few, alas, are recorded in the long annals of ages, and how wide the intervals of time and space that divide them. In all this dreary length of way, they appear like 5 or 6 lighthouses on as many thousand miles of coast. They gleam upon the surrounding darkness with an inextinguishable splendor, like stars seen through a mist. But they are seen like stars, to cheer, to guide, and to save. Washington is now added to that small number. Already he attracts curiosity, like a newly discovered star, whose benignant light will travel on to the world's and time's farthest bounds. Already his name is hung up by history as conspicuously as if it sparkled in one of the constellations of the sky. By commemorating his death, we are called this day to yield the homage that is due to virtue, and to confess the common debt of mankind, as well as our own, and to pronounce for posterity, now dumb, that eulogium, which they will delight to echo 10 ages hence when we are dumb. I consider myself not merely in the midst of the citizens of this town, or even of the state. In idea, I gather round me the nation. In the vast and venerable congregation of the patriots of all countries, and of all enlightened men, I would, if I could, raise my voice and speak to mankind in a strain worthy of my audience, and as elevated as my subject. But you have assigned me a task that is impossible. Oh, if I could perform it, if I could illustrate his principles in my discourse as he displayed them in his life, if I could paint the virtues as he practiced them, if I could convert the fervid enthusiasm of my heart into the talents to transmit his fame as it ought to pass to posterity, I should be the successful organ of your will, the ministers of his virtues, and may I dare to say, the humble partaker of his immortal glory. These are ambitious, deceiving hopes, and I reject them, for it is perhaps almost as difficult, at once with judgment and feeling, to praise great actions as to perform them. A lavish and undistinguishing elegium is not praise, and to discriminate such excellent qualities as were characteristic and peculiar to him would be to raise a name, as he raised it, above envy, above parallel, perhaps, for that very reason, above emulation. Such a portraying of character, however, must be addressed to the understanding, and therefore, even if it were well executed, would seem to be rather an analysis of moral principles than the recital of a hero's exploits. With whatever fidelity I might execute this task, I know that some would prefer a picture drawn to the imagination. They would have our Washington represented of a giant size, and in the character of a hero of romance. They who love to wonder better than to reason would not be satisfied with the contemplation of a great example, unless in the exhibition it should be so distorted into prodigy as to be both incredible and useless. Others, I hope but few, who think meanly of human nature, will deem it incredible that even Washington should think with as much dignity and elevation as he acted, and they will grovel in vain in the search for mean and selfish motives that could incite and sustain him to devote his life to his country. Do not these suggestions sound in your ears like a profanation of virtue? And while I pronounce them, do you not feel the thrill of indignation in your hearts? Forbear. Time never fails to bring every exalted reputation to a strict scrutiny. The world, in passing the judgment that is never to be reversed, will deny all partiality even to the name of Washington. Let it be denied, for its justice will confer glory. Such a life as Washington's cannot derive honor from the circumstances of birth and education, though it throws back a luster upon both. With an inquisitive mind that always profited by the light of others and was unclouded by passions of its own, he acquired a maturity of judgment, rare in age, unparalleled in youth. Perhaps no young man had so early laid up a life stock of materials for solid reflection, or settled so soon the principles and habits of his conduct. Gray experience listened to his counsels with respect, and at a time when youth is almost privileged to be rash, Virginia committed the safety of her frontier, and ultimately the safety of America, not merely to his valor, for that would be scarcely praise, but to his prudence. It is not in Indian wars that heroes are celebrated, but it is there that they are formed. No enemy can be more formidable by the craft of his ambushes, the suddenness of his onset, or the ferocity of his vengeance. The soul of Washington was thus exercised to danger, and on the first trial, as on every other, it appeared firm in adversity, cool in action, undaunted, self-possessed. His spirit, and still more his prudence, on the occasion of Braddock's defeat, diffused his name throughout America and across the Atlantic. Even then his country viewed him with complacency as her most hopeful son. At the peace of 1763, Great Britain, in consequence of her victories, stood in a position to prescribe her own terms. She chose, perhaps, better for us than for herself, for by expelling the French from Canada, we no longer feared hostile neighbors, and we soon found just cause to be afraid of our protectors. We discerned even then a truth which the conduct of France has so strongly confirmed, that there is nothing which the gratitude of weak states can give that will satisfy strong allies for their aid, but authority. Nations that want protectors will have masters. Our settlements, no longer checked by enemies on the frontier, rapidly increased, and it was discovered that America was growing to a size that could defend itself. In this, perhaps unforeseen, but at length obvious state of things, the British government conceived a jealousy of the colonies, of which, and of their intended measures of precaution, they made no secret. Our nation, like its great leader, had only to take counsel from its courage. When Washington heard the voice of his country in distress, his obedience was prompt, and though his sacrifices were great, they cost him no effort. Neither the object nor the limits of my plan permit me to dilate on the military events of the Revolutionary War. Our history is but a transcript of his claims on our gratitude. Our hearts bear testimony that they are claims not to be satisfied. When overmatched by numbers, a fugitive with a little band of faithful soldiers, the states as much exhausted as dismayed, he explored his own undaunted heart, and found there resources to retrieve our affairs. We have seen him display as much valor as gives fame to heroes, and as consummate prudence as ensures success to valor. Fearless of dangers that were personal to him, hesitating and cautious when they affected his country, preferring fame before safety or repose, and duty before fame. Rome did not owe more to Fabius than America to Washington. Our nation shares with him the singular glory of having conducted a civil war with mildness and a revolution with order. The event of that war seemed to crown the felicity and glory both of America and its chief. Until that contest, a great part of the civilized world had been surprisingly ignorant of the force and character, and almost of the existence of the British colonies. They had not retained what they knew, nor felt curiosity to know the state of 13 wretched settlements, which vast woods enclosed, and still vaster woods divided from each other. They did not view the colonists so much a people as a race of fugitives, whom want and solitude and intermixture with the savages had made barbarians. At this time, while Great Britain wielded a force truly formidable to the most powerful states, suddenly astonished Europe beheld a feeble people, till then unknown, stand forth and defy this giant to the combat. It was so unequal, all expected it would be short. Our final success exalted their admiration to its highest point. They allowed to Washington all that is due to transcendent virtue, and to the Americans more than is due to human nature. They considered us a race of Washingtons, and admitted that nature in America was fruitful only in prodigies. Their books and their travelers, exaggerating and distorting all their representations, assisted to establish the opinion that this is a new world, which with a new order of men and things adapted to it, that here we practice industry amidst abundance that requires none, that we have morals so refined that we do not need laws, and though we have them, yet we ought to consider their execution as an insult and a wrong, that we have virtue without weaknesses, sentiment without passions, and liberty without factions. These illusions, in spite of their absurdity, and perhaps because they are absurd enough to have dominion over the imagination only, have been received by many of the malcontents against the governments of Europe, and induced them to emigrate. Such illusions are too soothing to vanity to be entirely checked in their currency among Americans. They have been pernicious as they cherish false ideas of the rights of men and the duties of rulers. They have led the citizens to look for liberty where it is not, and to consider the government, which is its castle, as its prison. Washington retired to Mount Vernon, and the eyes of the world followed him. He left his countrymen to their simplicity and their passions, and their glory soon departed. Europe began to be undeceived, and it seemed for a time as if by the acquisition of independence our citizens were disappointed. The Confederation was then the only compact made to form a perfect union of the states, to establish justice, to ensure the tranquility, and provide for the security of the nation. And accordingly, union was a name that still commanded reverence, though not obedience. The system called justice was in some of the states iniquity reduced to elementary principles, and the public tranquility was much a portentous calm as rings in deep caverns before the explosion of an earthquake. Most of the states then were, in fact, though not in form, unbalanced democracies. Reason, it is true, spoke audibly in their constitutions, passion and prejudice louder in their laws. It is to the honor of Massachusetts that it is chargeable with little deviation from principles. Its adherence to them was one of the causes of a dangerous rebellion. It was scarcely possible that such governments should not be agitated by parties, and the prevailing party should not be vindictive and unjust. Accordingly, in some of the states, creditors were treated as outlaws. Bankrupts were armed with legal authority to the persecutors, and by the shock of all confidence and faith, society was shaken to its foundations. Liberty we had, but we dreaded its abuse almost as much as its loss, and the wise who deplored the one clearly foresaw the other. The peace of America hung by a thread, and factions were already sharpening their weapons to cut it. The project of free separate empires in America was beginning to be broached, and the progress of licentiousness would have seen rendered her citizens unfit for liberty in either of them. An age of blood and misery would have punished our disunion, but these were not the considerations to deter ambition from its purpose, while there were so many circumstances in our political situation to favor it. At this awful crisis, which all the wise so much dreaded at the time, yet which appears on a retrospect so much more dreadful than their fears, some man was wanting who possessed a commanding power over the popular passions, but over whom those passions had no power. That man was Washington. His name, at the head of such a list of worthies as would reflect honor on any country, had its proper weight with all the enlightened, and with almost all the well-disposed among the less informed citizens, and blessed be God, the Constitution was adopted. Yes, to the eternal honor of America among the nations of the earth, it was adopted, in spite of the obstacles which in any other country, and perhaps in any other age of this, would have been insurmountable, in spite of the doubts and fears which well-meaning prejudice creates for itself, and which party so artfully inflames into stubbornness, in spite of the vice which it is subjected to restrain, and which is therefore its immortal and implacable foe, in spite of the oligarchies in some of the states from whom it snatched dominion. It was adopted, and our country enjoys one more invaluable chance for its union and happiness. Invaluable, if the retrospect of the dangers we have escaped shall sufficiently inculcate the principles we have so tardily established. Perhaps multitudes are not to be taught by their fears only, without suffering much to deepen the impression. For experience brandishes in her school a whip of scorpions, and teaches nations her summary lessons of wisdom by the scars and wounds of their adversity. The amendments which have been projected in some of the states show that, in them at least, these lessons are not well remembered. In a confederacy of states, some powerful, others weak, the weakness of the federal union will sooner or later encourage and will not restrain the ambition and injustice of the members. The weak can no otherwise be strong or safe but in the energy of a national government. It is this defect which the blind jealousy of the weak states not unfrequently contributes to prolong, that has proved fatal to all the confederations that have ever existed. Although it was impossible that such merit as Washington's should not produce envy, it was scarcely possible that, with such a transcendent reputation, he should have rivals. Accordingly, he was unanimously chosen President of the United States. As a general and a patriot, the measure of his glory was already full. There was no fame left for him to excel but his own, and even that task, the mightiest of his labors, his civil magistracy has accomplished. No sooner did the new government begin its auspicious course than order seemed to arise out of confusion. Commerce and industry awoke, and were cheerful at their labors, for credit and confidence awoke with them. Everywhere there was the appearance of prosperity, and the only fear was that its progress was too rapid to consist of the purity and simplicity of ancient manners. The cares and labors of the President were incessant. His exhortations, example, and authority were employed to excite zeal and activity for the public service. Able officers were selected only for their merits, and some of them remarkably distinguished themselves by their successful management of the public business. Government was administered with such integrity, without mystery, and in so prosperous a course, that seemed to be wholly employed in acts of beneficence. Though it has made many thousand malcontents, it has never, by its rigor or injustice, made one man wretched. Such was the state of public affairs, and did it not seem perfectly to ensure uninterrupted harmony to the citizens? Did they not, in respect to their government and its administration, possess their whole heart's desire? They had seen and suffered long the want of an efficient constitution. They had freely ratified it. They saw Washington, their tried friend, the father of his country, invested with its powers. They knew that he could not exceed or betray them without forfeiting his own reputation. Consider for a moment what a reputation it was, such as no man ever before possessed by so clear a title and in so high a degree. His fame seemed in its purity to exceed even its brightness. Office took honor from his acceptance, but conferred none. Ambition stood awed and darkened by his shadow. For where, through the wide earth, was the man so vain as to dispute precedence with him, or what were the honors that could make the possessor Washington superior? Refined and complex as the ideas of the virtuous are, even the gross could discern in his life the infinite superiority of her rewards. Mankind perceived some change in their ideas of greatness, the splendor of power, and even of the name of conqueror had grown dim in their eyes. They did not know that Washington could augment his fame, but they knew and felt that the world's wealth and its empire, too, would be a bribe far beneath his acceptance. This is not exaggeration. Never was confidence in a man and a chief magistrate more widely diffused or more solidly established. If it had been in the nature of man that we should enjoy liberty without the agitations of parties, the United States had a right, under these circumstances, to expect it, but it was impossible. Where there is no liberty, they may be exempt from party. It will seem strange, but it scarcely admits a doubt that there are fewer malcontents in Turkey than in any free state in the world. Where the people have no power, they enter into no contests, and are not anxious to know how they shall use it. The spirit of discontent becomes torpid for the want of employment, and sighs itself to rest. The people sleep soundly in their chains, and do not even dream of the weight. They lose their turbulence of the energy, and become as tractable as any other animals, a state of degradation in which they extort our scorn and engage our pity for the misery they do not feel. Yet that heart is a base one, and fit only for a slave's bosom, that would not plead freely rather than submit to such a condition. For liberty, with all its parties and agitations, is more desirable than slavery. Who would not prefer the republics of ancient Greece, where liberty once subsisted? Who would not prefer the republics of ancient Greece, where liberty once subsisted in its excess, its delirium, terrible in its charms, and glistening to the last with the blaze of the very fire that consumed it? I do not know that I ought, but I am sure that I do, prefer those republics to the dozing slavery of the modern Greece, where the degraded wretches have suffered scorn till they merit it, where they tread on classic ground, on the ashes of heroes and patriots, unconscious of their ancestry, ignorant of the nature and almost of the name of liberty, and insensible even to the passion for it. Who, on this contrast, can forbear to say, it is the modern Greece that lies buried, that sleeps forgotten in the caves of Turkish darkness? It is the ancient Greece that lives in remembrance, that is still bright with glory, still fresh in immortal youth. They are unworthy of liberty who entertain a less exalted idea of its excellence. The misfortune is that those who profess to be its most passionate admirers generally have the least comprehension of its hazards and impediments. They expect that an enthusiastic admiration of its nature will reconcile the multitude to the irksomeness of its restraints, elusive expectations. Washington was not thus deluded. We have his solemn warning against the often fatal propensities of liberty. He had reflected that men are often false to their country and their honor, false to duty and even to their interest, but multitudes of men are never long false or deaf to their passions. These will find obstacles in the laws, associates in party. The fellowships thus formed are more intimate and impose commands more imperious than those of society. Thus party forms a state within the state, and is animated by a rivalship, fear, and hatred of its superior. When this happens, the merits of government will become fresh provocations and offenses, for they are the merits of an enemy. No wonder, then, that as soon as party found the virtue and glory of Washington were obstacles, the attempt was made, by calumny, to surmount them both. For this, the greatest of all his trials, we know that he was prepared. He knew that the government must possess sufficient strength from within or without, or fall victim to a faction. This interior strength was plainly inadequate to its defense, unless it could be reinforced from without by the zeal and patriotism of the citizens, and this latter resource was certainly as accessible to President Washington as to any chief magistrate that ever lived. The life of the federal government, he considered, was in the breath of the people's nostrils. Whenever they should happen to be so infatuated or inflamed as to abandon its defense, its end must be as speedy and might be as tragical as a constitution for France. While the President was thus administering the government in so wise and just a manner as to engage the great majority of the enlightened and virtuous citizens to cooperate with him for its support, and while he indulged the hope that time and habit were confirming their attachment, the French Revolution had reached that point in its progress where its terrible principles began to agitate all civilized nations. I will not, on this occasion, detain you to express, though my thoughts teem with it, my deep abhorrence of that revolution, its despotism by the mob or the military from the first, and its hypocrisy of morals to the last. Scenes have passed there which exceed description, and which for other reasons I will not attempt to describe, for it would not be impossible, even at this length of time, and with the sea between us and France, to go through with the recital of them, without perceiving horror gather like a frost about the heart, and almost stop its pulse. That revolution has been constant in nothing but its vicissitudes and its promises, always delusive, but always renewed, to establish philosophy by crimes, and liberty by the sword. The people of France, if they are not like the modern Greeks, find their cap of liberty as a soldier's helmet, and with all their imitation of dictators and consuls, their exactest similitude to these Roman ornaments is in their chains. The nations of Europe perceive another resemblance in all their all-conquering ambition. But it is only the influence of that event in America, and on the measures of the President, that belong to my subject. It would be ungratefully wrong to his character to be silent in respect to a part of it which has most signally illustrated his virtues. The genuine character of that revolution is not even yet so well understood as the dictates of self-preservation required should be. The chief duty and care of all society, of all governments, is to protect the rights of property and the tranquility of society. The leaders of the French Revolution, from the beginning, excited the poor against the rich. This has made the rich poor, but it will never make the poor rich. On the contrary, they were used as blind instruments to make those leaders masters, first of the adverse party and then of the state. Thus the powers of the state were turned round into a direction exactly contrary to the proper one, not to preserve tranquility and restrain violence, but to excite violence by the lure of power and plunder and vengeance. Thus all France has been, and still is, as much the prize of the ruling party as a captured ship, and if any right or possession has escaped confiscation, there is none that has not been liable to it. Thus it clearly appears that in its origin, its character, and its means, the government of that country is revolutionary, that is, not only different from, but directly contrary to, every regular and well-ordered society. It is a danger, similar in its kind and at least equal in its degree to that with which the ancient Rome menaced her enemies. The allies of Rome were slaves, and it cost some 100 years' efforts of her policy and arms to make her enemies her allies. Nations at this day can trust no better to treaties. They cannot even trust to arms, unless they are used with a spirit and perseverance becoming the magnitude of their danger. For the French Revolution has been from the first hostile to all rights and justice, to all peace and order in society, and therefore its very existence has been a state of warfare against the civilized world, and most of all against free and orderly republics, for such are never without factions, ready to be the allies of France, and to aid her in the work of destruction. Accordingly, scarcely any but republics have they subverted. Such governments, by showing in practice what republican liberty is, detect French imposture, and show what their pretexts are not. To subvert them, therefore, they had, besides the facility that faction affords, the double excitement of removing a reproach, and converting their greatest obstacles into most efficient auxiliaries. Who then, on careful reflection, will be surprised that the French and their partisans instantly conceived the desire and made the most powerful attempt to revolutionize the American government? But it will hereafter seem strange that their excesses should be excused as the effects of a struggle for liberty, and that so many of their citizens should be flattered, while they were insulted with the idea that our example was copied and our principles pursued. Nothing was ever more false or more fascinating. Our liberty depends on our education, our laws, our habits, to which even prejudices yield, on the dispersion of our people on farms, and on the almost equal diffusion of property. It is founded on morals and religion, whose authority reigns in the heart, and on the influence that these produce on public opinion, before that opinion governs rulers. Here, liberty is restraint. There it is violence. Here it is mild and cheering, like the morning sun of our summer, brightening the hills and making the valleys green. There it is like the sun, when his rays dart pestilence on the sands of Africa. American liberty calms and restrains the licentious passions, like an angel that says to the winds and troubled seas, "Be still." But how has French licentiousness appeared to the wretched citizens of Switzerland and Venice? Do not their haunted imaginations, even when they wake, represent her as a monster, with eyes that flash wildfire, hands that hurl thunderbolts, a voice that shakes the foundation of the hills? She stands, and her ambition measures the earth. She speaks, and an epidemic fury seizes the nations. Experience is lost upon us if we deny that it has seized a large part of the American nation. It is as sober and intelligent, as free, and as worthy to be free as any in the world. Yet, like all other people, we have passions and prejudices, and they have received a violent impulse which has for a time misled us. Jacobinism has become here, as in France, rather a sect than a party, inspiring a fanaticism that was equally intolerant and contagious. The delusion was general enough to be thought the voice of the people, therefore claiming authority without proof, and jealous enough to exact acquiescences without a murmur of contradiction. Some progress was made in training multitudes to be vindictive and ferocious. To them nothing seemed amiable but the revolutionary justice of Paris, nothing terrible but the government and justice of America. The very name of patriots was claimed and applied in proportion as the citizens had alienated their hearts from America, and transferred their affections to their foreign corrupter. Party discerned its intimate connection of the interests with France, and consummated its profligacy by yielding to the foreign influence. The views of these allies required that this country should engage in war with Great Britain. Nothing less would give to France all the means of annoying this dreaded rival. Nothing less would ensure the subjection of America as a satellite to the ambition of France. Nothing else could make a revolution here perfectly inevitable. For this end, the minds of the citizens were artfully inflamed, and the moment was watched and impatiently waited for when their long-heated passions should be in fusion, to pour them forth like the lava of a volcano, to blacken and consume the peace and government of our country. The systematic operations of a faction under foreign influence had begun to appear, and were successively pursued in a manner too deeply alarming to be soon forgotten. Who of us does not remember this worst of evils in the worst of ways? Shame would forget, if it could, that in one of the states amendments were proposed to break down the federal Senate, which, as in the state governments, is a great bulwark of public order. To break down another, an extravagant judiciary power was claimed for the states. In another state, a rebellion was fomented by the agents of France, and who, without fresh indignation, can remember that the powers of government were openly usurped, troops levied, and ships fitted out to fight for her. Nor can any true friend to our government consider without dread that soon afterwards the treaty-making power was boldly challenged for a branch of the government from which the Constitution has wisely withholden it. I am oppressed, and know not how to proceed with my subject. Washington, blessed be God, who endued him with wisdom and clothed him with power. Washington issued his proclamation of neutrality, and at an early period arrested the intrigues of France and the passions of his countrymen on the very edge of the precipice of war and revolution. This act of firmness, at the hazard of his reputation and peace, entitles him to the name of first of patriots. Time was gained for the citizens to recover their virtue and good sense, and they soon recovered them. The crisis was past, and America was saved. You and I, most respected fellow citizens, should be sooner tired than satisfied in recounting the particulars of this illustrious man's life. How great he appeared while he administered the government, how much greater when he retired from it, how he accepted the chief military command under his wise and upright successor, how his life was unspotted like his fame, and how his death was worthy of his life, are so many distinct subjects of instruction, and each of them singly more enough for an elegium. I leave the task, however, to his history and to posterity. They will be faithful to it. It is not impossible that some will affect to consider the honors paid to this great patriot by the nation as excessive, idolatrous, and degrading to freedmen, who are all equal. I answer that refusing to virtue its legitimate honors would not prevent their being lavished in future on any worthless and ambitious favorite. If this day's example should have its natural effect, it will be salutary. Let such honors be so conferred only when in future they shall be so merited, when the public sentiment will not be misled, nor the principles of a just equality corrupted. The best evidence of reputation is a man's whole life. We have now, alas, all Washingtons before us. There has scarcely appeared a really great man whose character has been more admired in his lifetime, or less correctly understood by his admirers. When it is comprehended, it is no easy task to delineate its excellences in such a manner as to give to the portrait both interest and resemblance, for it requires thought and study to understand the true ground of his superiority of his character over many others, whom he resembled in the principles of his actions, and even in the manner of acting. But perhaps he excels all the great men that ever lived, in the steadiness of his adherence to the maxims of life, and in the uniformity of all his conduct to the same maxims. These maxims, though wise, were yet not so remarkable for their wisdom, as for their authority over his life, for if there were any errors in his judgment, and he discovered as few as any man, we know of no blemishes in his virtue. He was the patriot without reproach. He loved his country well enough to hold his success in serving it in ample recompense. Thus far self-love and love of country coincided. But when his country needed sacrifices that no other men could, or perhaps would be willing to make, he did not even hesitate. This was virtue in its most exalted character. More than once he put his fame at hazard, when he had reason to think it would be sacrificed, at least in this age. Two instances cannot be denied, when the army was disbanded, and again when he stood like Leonidas at the pass of Thermopylae to defend our independence against France. It is indeed almost as difficult to draw his character as the portrait of his virtue. The reasons are similar. Our ideas of moral excellence are obscure because they are complex, and we are obliged to resort to illustrations. Washington's example is the happiest to show what virtue is, and to delineate his character, we naturally expatiate on the beauty of virtue. Much must be felt and much imagined. His preeminence is not so much to be seen in the display of any one virtue as in the possession of them all, and in the practice of the most difficult. Hereafter, therefore, his character must be studied before it will be striking, and then it will be admitted as a model, a precious one to a free republic. It is no less difficult to speak of his talents. They were adapted to lead without dazzling mankind, and to draw forth and employ the talents of others without being misled by them. In this he was certainly superior, that he neither mistook nor misapplied his own. His great modesty and reserve would have concealed them, if great occasions had not called them forth. And then, as he never spoke from the affections to shine, nor acted from any sinister motives, it is from their effects only that we are to judge of their greatness and extent. In public trusts, where men acting conspicuously are cautious, and in those private concerns where few conceal or resist their weaknesses, Washington was uniformly great, pursuing right conduct from right maxims. His talents were such as assist a sound judgment, and ripen with it. His prudence was consummate, and seemed to take the direction of his powers and passions. For as a soldier he was more solicitous to avoid mistakes that might be fatal than to perform exploits which are brilliant, and as a statesman to adhere to just principles, however old, than to pursue novelties. And therefore, in both characters, his qualities were singularly adapted to the interest, and were tried in the greatest perils of his country. His habits of inquiry were so far remarkable that he was never satisfied with investigating, nor desisted from it, so long as he had less than all the light which he could obtain upon a subject, and then he made his decision without bias. This command over the partialities that so generally stop men short, or turn them aside in their pursuit of truth, is one of the chief causes of his unvaried course of right conduct in so many difficult scenes, where every human actor must be presumed to err. If he had strong passions, he had learned to subdue them, and to be moderate and mild. If he had weaknesses, he concealed them, which is rare, and excluded them from the government of his temper and conduct, which is still more rare. If he loved fame, he never made improper compliances for what is called popularity. The fame he enjoyed is of the kind that will last forever, yet it was rather the effect than the motive of his conduct. Some future Plutarch will search for a parallel to his character. Epaminondas is perhaps the brightest name of all antiquity. Our Washington resembled him in the purity and ardor of his patriotism, and like him, he first exalted the glory of his country. There, it is to be hoped, the parallel ends, for Thebes fell with Epaminondas, but such comparisons cannot be pursued far without departing from the similitude, for we shall find it as difficult to compare great men as great rivers. Some we admire for the length and rapidity of their current and the grandeur of their cataracts, others for the majestic silence and fullness of their streams. We cannot bring them together to measure the difference of their waters. The unambitious life of Washington, declining fame, yet courted by it, seemed, like the Ohio, to choose its long way for solitudes, diffusing fertily, or like his own Potomacs, widening and deepening his channel as he approaches the sea, and displaying most the usefulness and serenity of his greatness towards the end of his course. Such a citizen would do honor to any country. The constant veneration and affection of his country will show that it was worthy of such a citizen. However his military fame may excite the wonders of mankind, it is chiefly by his civil magistracy that all example will instruct them. Great generals have arisen in all ages of the world, and perhaps most in those of despotism and darkness. In times of violence and convulsion, they rise by the force of the whirlwind, high enough to ride on it, and direct the storm. Like meteors, they glare on the black clouds with a splendor that, while it dazzles and terrifies, makes nothing visible but the darkness. The fame of heroes is indeed growing vulgar. They multiply in every war. They stand in history and thicken in their ranks, almost as indistinguishable as their own soldiers. But such a chief magistrate as Washington appears like the pole star in a clear sky to direct a skillful statesman. His presidency will form an epoch and be distinguished as the Age of Washington. Already it assumes its high place in the political region. Like the Milky Way, it whitens along its allotted portion of the hemisphere. The latest generations of men will survey, through the telescope of history, the space where so many virtues blend their rays, and the light to separate them into groups and distinct virtues. As the best illustration of them, the living monument to which the first of patriots would have chosen to consign his fame, it is my earnest prayer to heaven that our country may subsist even to that late day in the plenitude of its liberty and happiness, and mingle its mild glory with Washington's.